I made a decision to be an artist really young. You know, I would say maybe when I was 10, I thought I was going to be an artist, maybe at 8. But what you think an artist is at that age is very different than what you think it is at age 20, at age 40, at age 50, at age 60. It keeps changing. And I realize that I have to keep evaluating why I continue making what I'm calling art. Maybe not everyone would identify it that way. Maybe I'm playing it safe by calling it art and not calling it my life. Maybe the distinction between the two is less than I pretend. It really keeps transforming, and keeps transforming in relation to my own needs and the context in which I'm living and working. I did organize what became Mobius in 1975. We didn't take the name until 1977, but I was only a year and a half out of undergraduate. And what I did was get a studio and invite a group of artists really working in all media to develop original work. And we were interested in exploring what live performance might really be. We were interested in working outside of traditional art sites. So we were in bookstores and cafes and on the street. And we were interested in the kind of dynamics that can exist between a viewer or an audience and the artist and the maker of the work. You can't do that in many other art forms. You are not both there at the same time. You're not making the work with the viewer present. So we were interested in designing works that really responded to the viewer, that gave them a role, and worked with the dynamic of the live event. It included smell, it included taste, touch. We were always working in spaces where there was no separation between where the viewer was and the artist, so that there was a kind of fluidity in how the actions progressed and the territory that the artist and the audience occupied. The other reason I started Mobius is because I wanted to experiment, and when you're alone and you come up with a brilliant idea, the next day you think it's really stupid and you don't do it. And I needed a group of people to hold me to my ideas. So initially we would meet once a month, describe what we were going to do. People would offer to help if we needed help. We went off and did it, and then we came back at the end of the month and showed the work to each other. That group of people essentially held my feet to the fire and said, do it, go ahead, do it, try it. We started inviting some other artists as an audience and friends. They were private events, but that is really what evolved into Mobius. Mobius now has about 25 members who are in other parts of the world as well. Al Putnam here lives in Dublin now. We have a member in the Czech Republic. We have another member who lives in Taiwan. So the group has continued. The membership comes and goes. It's by invitation, and people stay as long as they want, and then we invite more people when they leave. And it really has the same structure. We show work to each other, we help each other. We also now run a public space, and so we extend that kind of support to other artists in the community and other artists nationally and internationally. So it really is a kind of network of artists that support the making of new work and critique it together. The mid-'80s, I started teaching at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. I started with one class in performance. And very gradually, the program that I was running in performance expanded, and we were able to hire other people, and eventually we were teaching 11 different classes in performance every semester. But I have since quit, and the department has shrunk. One of the factors in how my work changed over time was, in fact, something that's identified in the United States as the culture wars. In the early 90s, the conservative right-wing politicians decided that they wanted to take back the culture. They were suspicious of government support for the arts, and eventually they held up videotapes of performance artists on the floor of Congress and said, this work is obscene, we need to defund the National Endowment for the Arts, and indeed they did. So there was a certain period in the 80s when the National Endowment for the Arts was really interested in supporting living artists, making challenging work about politics, about social issues, about gender politics. And then at a certain point, they completely got rid of that. We did not exist. They didn't want to deal with us. It trickled down to the states. The state of Massachusetts, where I live, 20 years ago had a category of fellowships for individual artists that included people working in new genres. And they got rid of that 20 years ago and would only accept applications from playwrights, sculptors, painters, the very traditional categories. This year they reinstated new genres. So, I've lived long enough to see this circle come around. What's also true is that the new influx of curators in museums are younger, and they're always looking for something new to program, and suddenly performance art is coming back in again, as if it didn't exist for the last 20 years. In fact, it was very much underground. Boston has, because of the school and because of Mobius, has always had a large community of performance art artists and a lot of activity, but much of it was, in studios, in basements, and with the internet very much publicized within the community and not so visible to the public. Now that it's re-entering the major institutions, it's suddenly like, oh, I had an interview with a journalist last week who was like, oh, there hasn't been any performance art in Boston until now. And it's like, well, yeah. What did happen is many performance artists in the United States stopped making live performance and began making video and installation. And much of the work had a performative element, but they would not identify themselves as performance artists. We were really considered the demons. We were the ones who destroyed the NEA, so we were very much pushed away and considered a real threat for any institution. That was the point that I started making work outside of the country, because there were opportunities that I didn't have in the US. So I was also at that point really curious to see how artists operated within their own communities in different countries, the kind of work that was done, what they were responding to. So the opportunity to travel, I really valued and took advantage of. I will say that the United States has no funding for artists to travel. We all pay for it out of our own pocket if we're going to a situation that doesn't have funding for artist travel. I really early on decided that I wasn't going to allow the agenda of the government to determine my agenda. I also had a teaching job that let me afford to travel, and I didn't spend money on other things. So you make your choices as an artist. If it's important for you to make work, then you need to find a way. And there are a lot of artists that gave up during that era, sadly. You see many young artists in the United States, and you don't see so many middle-aged artists other than maybe painters. This is a piece I made in 1991. So this was a really significant transition piece for me. I was because we had a space, Mobius had a performance space, it was very comfortable to do things indoors, and it was like I either had a white room or a black room to work in. There was lots of flexibility in terms of the size of the space. But at this point, I felt like maybe I had reached the limit of my ideas on an indoor space, so I decided I would work outdoors. This was actually a performance for audiences of a single person. It took 3 years for me to do it for 6 people. It took place in the snow at dusk, so I could only do one a day, and realistically only on the weekends. And for the first 2 years, it didn't snow in Boston, or it did, like only briefly. This was a work that I designed because I wanted to see what it was like to make a piece that was impossible to document. And the documentation of this work is actually the 6 people describing their experience on camera. So what they had agreed to do was drive out into the country, meet me on a street corner in the country, leave their car behind, get into mine. I drove them around, and at 15 minutes before sunset, I dropped them off and said, "This is called Red in Woods. It involves all your senses. It takes place both near and far. You can engage with it any way that you wish, and be careful, and you'll know when it's over." So I let them off and drove away. Follow the red yarn path. Did I include that? That was part of it. Follow the red yarn path. So this was the red yarn path. So as they started off, they didn't know how long this would take. It was the winter. It was in the snow. It was cold. They knew that they were going to meet me in 3 days to talk to me in the video studio about it. They had agreed not to talk about it to anyone else in the interim. I had cited about 30 different images in the landscape. There were things to eat that went from chocolate-covered cherries to ultimately raw liver. And a box of teeth. There was a really large dog chewing on bloody bones off in a field. There was in the distance a bed. But the path would take them past these things, and they had to decide if they would step off the path to engage the material or the object. And they didn't know how long anything would take. So most of them were pretty unnerved starting out. And the first thing they actually encountered was a little girl across a stream. And so there was a very strange shift of feeling vulnerable and childlike as they followed the path to suddenly being an adult in relation to a child in the landscape. she actually responded to a voice saying, "Where are you?" and went away from them through the woods, disappeared. So things like this, seeds in a log, it was unclear whether I had placed those or whether they were there already, but they did relate to the color red, which was the one element that they did know. There was a meal down in a little hollow, so if they went down in the hollow, many of them felt like they were being watched from above. No one was watching this person, actually, but they felt like it. And there was hot tea and strawberries, I think. There were flowers in one place blooming in the woods, and you can hardly see it, but there's the bed across and there's a person standing in front of it. So as they approached the bed, and you can actually see the path, the yarn is there. As they thought they were approaching the person started moving towards them, but also disappeared. So a red chair up in a tree. What I was interested in doing was trying to figure out how to create the experience of Red Riding Hood in a way that would generate the kinds of questions that she had on that walk to her grandmother's, the decisions she had to make. And in fact, what happens in this piece is that the person is at different times in the role of Red Riding Hood, but at another point in the role of the wolf when they meet the little girl. So there was a very fluid sort of shift of their understanding of who they were in the landscape. At one point they heard their name being whispered. They didn't see anyone. There was someone on a path asking them to come closer, who disappeared into the woods and left behind the box of teeth. So the images had the sort of pleasure, eerie shift as it got darker and darker. Of course, they came out right near their car. This is a piece called American Foreign Policy 4. So I did a series of works called American Foreign Policy, really as a result of traveling to other parts of the world when President Bush had just invaded Iraq. So I was in the role of American, and people saying, "What the hell is going on?" But this one I did in the United States, but I was in Los Angeles. And it was right when Bush was building the wall between Mexico and the United States, or trying to build a wall. So Los Angeles, fluff and wonder. It's white, or it thinks it's white. So I was in this gallery that had actually an ant infestation, and they were really worried that I was going to build a wall out of bread and try to wall myself into the corner of this room. And do you know what fluff is? You know, it never rots, it never decays, it never molds. It's sugar, egg white. That might be it, sugar and egg white. They used to sell it off of a truck. So I put the Wonder Bread and the fluff out on the courtyard the day before this performance to see how the ants would behave, and it was where people ate lunches. I came back the next morning, you know, the wheat bread sandwich with peanut butter was, you know, like black with ants, and the Wonder Bread and fluff, not a single ant. Smarter than humans. So they decided it was fine to build this wall. This is one of those, and I was listening to conservative radio on my earphones and repeating it out loud as I was hearing it, which I don't know if you know the effect of that. The person speaking ends up speaking very flat because they're listening and trying to say it as they're hearing it. So it doesn't have the emotive quality that the original speaker has. One of those happy accidents, as I built the wall, I had enough bread to build it right up to the ceiling, and there's my containers of fluff. And I have the trowel for bricklaying. But because the bread wasn't old, it was very soft, it kept sagging and sliding away. So, ironically, that image was maybe more appropriate for the wall between Mexico and California than being able to build it right to the ceiling. I decided pretty early on that I wanted to not bring a prepared work to a location and ask to be scheduled on the last possible day and spend those few days in between looking at what was there, talking to people, going to the market and seeing what materials were available, and to really make a piece that was a kind of conversation between me and the location. I certainly have done a lot of research before I travel. I am often very careful to understand what the American presence has been in a particular country before I arrive, so I understand what people's attitudes towards me might be. And it does mean that I try to make a performance that is has a kind of openness that doesn't come from a position of authority, but comes from a kind of question and conversation with the viewers. So this one was actually in Concepcion, Chile, which suffered a very devastating earthquake about a year before we were there. And while many of the buildings were under repair, there were ones that were had these ribbons forbidding entrance, and where you really noticed it was on the sidewalks. Nothing was even. There was a lot of rubble, so you were very carefully always looking down while you were walking. It took until the morning of this performance to get permission to actually stand inside the ribbon.